So, my name is Christina Clark-kazak. I'm an associate professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa and past president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christina. So I guess I want to start off by asking what federal policies, in particular, possibly harm migrants and maybe lead to more border crossings, illegal border crossings.
So, in Canada, immigration is a federal government responsibility, but there are also provincial jurisdictions and legislation that affect migrants. But at the federal level, the main policy that restricts people is being able to get to Canada in the first place. So, Canada has a number of what are called externalization policies. So, these are policies that administratively make it very difficult for people to get into Canada in the first place. So, one would be, for example, visa policies. So, in order for people to be able to get onto an airplane, but also to get into Canada, they require a visa usually. And there is a direct correlation between the level of unrest and difficulty in a country and the requirement for a visa. So, if you think about any country that's on the news right now, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Venezuela, Ethiopia, all of these countries, if you're a citizen of those countries, you require a visa to come to Canada. So that's one externalization policy. The second is aircraft or carrier sanctions. So this means that if a transportation company allows someone to come to Canada without the required paperwork, it's the company actually that is fined and penalized. And so this means that it sort of contracts out the responsibility from the government to these private companies. And the private companies don't have the same level of oversight as a Canadian government official would. And so that's why you see people being denied boarding, for example, at an airport, even if they believe they have their papers, because the company doesn't want to take the risk of being fined. A third policy is the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States. And so you mentioned earlier border crossings. So this means that a migrant can only make an asylum claim in the first country that they arrive at, whether it be the US or Canada. And so this makes it very difficult for people to cross at a formal border crossing because if they do and they want to claim asylum, they'll be sent back to the United States. And so this is why we see irregular crossings, especially around, for example, Roxham Road near Montreal, because people can't go through an official border crossing if they want to make an asylum claim because they'll simply be sent back to the United States with very few exceptions. There are a couple of exceptions. But generally speaking, if you want to make an asylum claim, you have to do that in the first country you arrive at versus US or Canada.
Okay. Thank you for explaining this. I just wanted to double check regarding the visa requirements. Are they only for countries that are maybe I guess I could call it unstable, or it's all countries all the time?
So it's not all countries all the time. Canada makes an assessment about whether or not visas are required. So, for example, for if you're a U.S. citizen, generally speaking, you do not require a visa to come into Canada. But Mexico is a very interesting case study, for example, because Mexico is part of the North America free trade zone, and Canada has, at different points in history, required or not required a visa from Mexico. So it's an assessment of whether or not Canadian officials believe that someone from that country would have a high risk of staying in Canada. And so because of that, basically, it means that people who are coming from countries at war or countries where there's a high level of asylum claims once they arrive in Canada, this tends to trigger a visa requirement. So perversely, it actually it prevents people from being able to get to Canada to make an asylum claim in the first place.
Okay, interesting. And then I don't know if this is maybe too kind of tedious for you to answer, but what is making an asylum claim? What does this process kind of look like?
So in Canada, you make a refugee claim once you arrive in the territory. So you cannot do it from outside of Canada. And once someone arrives in Canada, they can make a claim at a border post, but they can also make an inland claim. So in some cases, for example, someone may have come here as an international student, and then the situation in their country may have changed. So an example of this is Syria. There were many examples of people who came here on a student visa intending to go back to Syria. Then the situation in Syria changes and they make a claim. Then the claim goes to the Immigration and Refugee Board. So the IRB is an independent but tribunal that basically assesses asylum claims. The people who are on the IRB are appointed by the Government of Canada. It is not an adversarial court situation, so it's not intended to be a situation where there is an adversarial situation. However, it does, the experience of many people in the IRB process is that they are being forced to defend their claim. So they have to explain why, and under Canadian law, but also under international law, to have an asylum claim, you need to have a fear of persecution because of the membership in a particular category. So this could be based on race, religion, etc. And in Canada, we also accept claims based on gender or sexual identity. This is not the case in all countries around the world, including in the US. It's much more difficult in the United States to make a claim on gender or sexual identity or sexual based violence. And this is why some people say they cannot make their asylum claim in the US. And this is a challenge to the Safe Third Country Agreement that I've mentioned before. So they have to make a claim to the IRB, and the Immigration and Refugee Board makes a decision. And if they're granted asylum, they're able to then remain in Canada. If they're not granted asylum, then they're usually deported, or there's a process for removing them from the country.
Thank you so much. In the global article, I did see some references to some policies and laws that do kind of criminalize migrants. Is there any kind of policies or laws you might be able to highlight that does this?
Yeah, so one of the laws that does criminalize migrants is the Safe Third Country Agreement, because basically, if you do not make a claim, you cannot make a claim at a border crossing. Otherwise, you're sent back to the United States. So, therefore, you're required to cross irregularly to therefore make a claim. And by crossing irregularly, you're violating administrative law because you're crossing at a non official border crossing. And so this criminalizes, because in order to actually get to Canada to make the claim, it's requiring people to do something irregular or criminal under administrative law in order to get access. So this is one example of the criminalization. A second example is when people are not able to get a visa to come to Canada but want to make an asylum claim in Canada, that this then allows for some process of smuggling. So basically, people have to pay off transportation companies or other individuals in order to get to Canada to make the claim, even though they have fraudulent documents or documents or non-existent documents. And so this is another way in which people are being forced to violate law in order to gain access to asylum in Canada. What is very interesting under international law, people cannot actually be penalized for using irregular routes to get to a country. So you're not supposed to be able to penalize people, because there is a recognition that in some cases, because people are fleeing for their lives, they're required to go outside of the norms in order to access a safe haven. But the system is such that it's set up to basically force people in many cases to commit at least an administrative crime or to violate administrative law in order to get access.
And then, say for example, like a family or an individual does, you know, commit an administrative crime of this form. Is it typical that they would be put in a detention center, or they might, if caught, or are there cases where they might be allowed to still make that refugee claim?
So they are still permitted to make the refugee claim, but sometimes as they are waiting for the refugee claim to be heard, they are put in either immigration detention or in provincial um, penitentiaries or criminal justice facilities. Because in Canada, there are only three immigration detention centers, one in Laval, one in Toronto, and one in Vancouver. So if you're outside of those major metropolis centers, then you're detained within a regular provincial correctional facility.
Is there any possibility Canada could kind of change these policies or laws to make things easier for migrants?
So the Safe Third Country Agreement has been the subject of much advocacy and debate and has gone to the Supreme Court of Canada. So we're still waiting for the final decision on that. So definitely there's a lot of advocacy from human rights and refugee rights advocates to try to change that particular law. On the visa front, what's quite interesting is currently both the NDP and the Conservatives are calling on the federal government to drop the visa requirement for citizens of Ukraine. So in Canada, we have a lot of Ukrainian Canadians with family members in Ukraine who are concerned about their safety and want to be able to bring them to Canada. So you can see where, in some cases, diaspora politics or localized interest in particular groups. We also saw this in the context of Haiti, for example, after the earthquake. So in some cases, there is political pressure to change laws. But I think that as a general system, the system is based on borders and defending of borders and maintenance of borders. And so as long as we have a system that's based on borders, there will be visas and there will be other ways in which the Canadian state can prevent people from coming into Canada. And Canada as a country is very geographically removed from many of the contexts in which refugees flee or immigrants are trying to. So it's difficult for people to get here. And because of that, the Canadian state actually is able to quite effectively prevent people through these administrative processes like visas and border restrictions. The case is very different when you get to, for example, even the United States. The United States is much easier to get to through Central America and Mexico and even by sea for a lot of migrants and refugees than Canada is. And so I think that Canada, because of our geography, but also because of our politics, there is a kind of Fortress Canada kind of approach in terms of trying to prevent people from accessing our territory in the first place.
Have you noticed that, I guess maybe this has not changed much since the Conservatives, I mean, I'm not sure, but have you noticed that maybe over the years border restrictions have increased in Canada or policies as well?
So this is very interesting because actually there is quite a lot of political consensus about the borders and the maintenance of borders. So, because we tend to either have a liberal or a conservative government in power, in some cases it's a minority government like currently, but generally speaking, the liberals and the conservatives, while they do differ in terms of the implementation of some of these policies, the policies themselves are quite tenacious. The only political parties where they have some difference in opinion are the New Democratic Party. So the NDP have been calling for a long time for the abolishing of the Safe Third Country Agreement, for example, and also the Greens. But in terms of the parties that actually tend to hold power, either as a minority or majority government, both the Conservatives and the Liberals have maintained fairly consistent policies on a lot of these issues. Again, it's about the implementation that might differ. The ways in which they actually apply and enforce the policies differ, and maybe the rhetoric surrounding it. So definitely under the Conservatives, the previous Conservative government, there was a much more anti-immigrant or anti-refugee, at least, rhetoric. But in terms of the actual policies at play, they've been fairly consistent across the political landscape.
And are you noticing that it's maybe a global kind of approach or global issues among countries across the world that their borders are tightening?
So definitely, I agree with you that this is a worldwide trend. I also think it's been exacerbated by COVID. So COVID-19 has given countries a public health reason for closing borders, and some of us are concerned that once borders are closed or hardened, it becomes more difficult to open or soften those borders in the future. And we have seen across immigration categories a drop in the number of immigrants who have been admitted to Canada. Although the levels, we just recently had the immigration levels announced for the next a couple of years, and those are higher than they have been in the past. I think that what we do see is a hardening of borders, and also politicians are responding to public opinion. And there is a public opinion that is strong and vocal that fears the other. And this has been across history, and I think at certain moments of history, though, that those fears become more pronounced, and they become more vocal. And so we definitely have seen this in the context of a virus that, defies, if you will, international borders. There's been a clamping down and a hardening of borders. There also is, unfortunately, a rise in xenophobic and racist kind of discourse and rhetoric. And so this also feeds a sort of anti-immigration impulse within the general public, which then translates into politicians hardening down on borders.
And I get, I mean, I guess you kind of already answered this with the increase in border crossings, but as a result of a rise in xenophobic, racist opinions, public opinions, and the borders tightening, can we maybe continue to see an increase in border crossings?
So I think that we have to be careful about attribution. There's not necessarily a direct correlation between public opinion and what people are doing. People are crossing borders for a variety of different reasons: economic, political, for their own safety, for family reunification. And so the reasons why people are migrating will ebb and flow depending on the context. So, for example, now we are also getting more environmental migration, people who are moving because of a degradation of their environment or environmental related livelihood kind of issues, like a loss in their ability to farm or fish or things like this. And so, I think we have to get around this idea that migration is somehow exceptional. Human beings have migrated, throughout human history for a whole host of different reasons. And putting up barriers or borders is not going to prevent them. It's going to make it more difficult for them to legally access sovereign territories, but it's not going to prevent them necessarily from migrating. And what we see across the world is that, in fact, when borders tighten, it leads people to make more and more desperate journeys and more dangerous journeys. And it actually taps into a sort of underground, illegal way for people to get across borders. So the increase in smuggling is definitely tied directly to the hardening of borders. And so, I think that we have to think very carefully as citizens, but also as policymakers, about how we manage and think about the reality of migration. The other problem with a lot of the discourse in policymaking is thinking of migration as a problem that needs to be solved. It's not a problem, it's a phenomena. It's something that happens. So we need to kind of think very carefully about how we address those, and how can we address the root causes of why people are leaving in the first place, in order to really facilitate migration. Again, I mean, I understand that governments want to manage it. They want to understand why people are coming. They want to be able to account for why people are coming. But this is why actually some of the policies like detention, like the Safe Third Country Agreement, like visa requirements, are actually not logical. They don't make sense, because by restricting people's legal ability to be able to come into a country, it actually drives people into irregular routes. And those irregular routes are much more difficult to manage and account for. I mean, we don't even have statistics then, right? If you're interested in making sure that people who come to Canada, for example, have been vaccinated against COVID, you need to know who's coming, and you need to have a process for being able to assess that. And once you drive people underground and into informal activities, it becomes much more difficult to be able to monitor and assess that.
Thank you. Something I did want to ask links to what happened with the Indian family who froze to death recently. I did kind of see some discourse online, blaming people who smuggle immigrants and allow them to kind of pass through borders. But is it wrong to blame smugglers?
So I do think we really need to distinguish here between trafficking and smuggling. So trafficking is when the individual does not consent to moving. Smuggling is when the person consents to moving, but there's no clear legal way for them to migrate. And so then they turn to smugglers who facilitate that passage. And so, again, I think that by focusing in on the smuggling, um, there often is a conflation between trafficking and smuggling, and I think that's problematic, and they need to be distinguished. But second of all, we need to think about why are people having to entrust their lives to smugglers. And the reason is because of the restrictive border policies. So I think that it's a very easy political move, and it's also a fairly clear cut sort of legal process, because obviously smuggling is illegal. So by targeting the smuggler, you're kind of perceived to be doing something about the problem. But the point is that as long as people want to move and cannot move legally, they're going to have to resort to these kinds of methods. And so trying one individual for smuggling is not going to resolve the underlying issues around it. And I also have to say that in some cases, while yes, technically, legally, we're talking about smuggling, in some cases, these are family members. In some cases, they're taxi drivers. In some cases, they're individuals who are facilitating the movement of people who want to move. They're not necessarily a part of organized criminal activities as one thinks of when one thinks of smuggling. And so again, I think that the issues here are quite complex and need to be unpacked. And the policy response also has to be much more nuanced and broad ranging, as opposed to targeting and criminalizing individual smugglers, because this is not going to get at the root of the issue.
And I guess I just wanted to ask one person that my colleague interviewed. She works as a nanny for a family in Montreal, but she's had some kind of difficulties with them, especially in relation to COVID. And when asked, how could her situation be improved, she did say, why doesn't Canada make it easier to access residency? Why don't they grant it to us once we come here for work? Especially with, live-in nannies, there's kind of that issue that if their family no longer wants them, will they be sent back? Things like this. Do you think that residency or access to Canadian citizenship should be made easier to access?
So I definitely think access to permanent residency and more permanent forms of migration should be increased. Because, as you say, it protects the workers, but it also provides more stability for the individual, and it also allows them a pathway to citizenship, a pathway to permanency that is good for the Canadian economy, good for Canadian society. When people know that they can stay there long term, they're going to invest in relationships and community and buying houses and things like this. So I think that is definitely the case. And I think that the question really also touches on the vulnerabilities associated with migration when people are not in a situation where their status can be regularized and made more permanent. And so this is really ripe for exploitation because, as you mentioned, people are afraid to complain. They're afraid to report abuses, work-related abuses, or other kinds of human rights abuses, if they feel like by doing so, their status is going to be revoked. And so, I do think there needs to be more ways in which there's pathways. And we in Canada have a lot of temporary workers, especially in the agricultural sectors, also in care work, as you mentioned. And these sectors need to think more seriously about this is not obviously not a functional business model. If you are relying on exploiting labor in order to make money in agriculture and care work, clearly this is not a situation that's sustainable. And so there's a fundamentally economic problem here if it's not. If you're relying on this type of labor. And so I think, again, it requires a structural change and a joining up of immigration policy with some of the economic policies and some of a hard look at some of these industries that regularly use individuals in a temporary work capacity, because clearly this is not a sustainable model.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions I didn't ask that you want to put forth, or just anything that's important to keep in mind?
So I would just maybe touch on, because in the email you mentioned the person who had died in the Laval detention facility. And so I think part of this story is also the detention piece and the fact that migrants who are in detention, both within these immigration detention centers, but also within provincial correctional facilities, they're detained under administrative law. So it's not a criminal offense. And because it's administrative law, there's not necessarily the checks and balances that people who are detained for criminal reasons have. And so there's not as much oversight. For example, we still don't know the name and the circumstances of the person who died in an immigration detention facility weeks after that event occurred. And I think that average Canadians don't understand the scale and the scope of how people who come to Canada who are trying to immigrate here are being held, detention and deprivation of liberty is a serious thing. Under criminal law, there's a whole host of reasons why someone has detained, and they have rights, including the right to a certain limited time within detention. Whereas immigration detention is indefinite. They're not given a sentence when they first are detained. They're not told you're going to be held for 6 years or 6 months. So once they go into the system, it becomes very difficult for them to get out of the system, and there is very little oversight over the system. And the other thing I would like to highlight as someone who works on child rights is that children are often detained within the system, not as detainees, but as guests of a parent or guardian. So in other words, because under international law, but also under Canadian law, detention of children is a very serious thing and should be done as a last resort. Generally speaking, children are not detained as individuals in the detention center, but the parents or guardians are detained, and then they're given a choice, a so-called choice. Are your children going to be detained with you as guests in the detention center, or will they be released to children's services? Now, if you've crossed international borders and you don't know the system and you're fearful of the state, you're not necessarily going to allow your child to be placed in care, but that means that they're then being detained. And they're being detained not in a kind of regular way. They're being detained as guests. And so they're not necessarily captured in the statistics. And I think that this is an area where a lot of Canadians don't know the degree to which children are being kept in detention. And also immigration detention is often for, most of immigration detention is because they can't confirm the identity. So lack of identity documents, or the identity documents are not are not accepted for one reason or another. There's very few cases where there's criminality involved. Usually it's identity documents, or because they feel like the person is a flight risk, that they won't go and report to an immigration hearing. And so, to detain people is a serious deprivation of liberty, is a serious human rights issue. And we're doing it regularly in Canada without a lot of oversight. And I think that this is something that average Canadians should know more about, and that, we should be having much more of a policy discussion about why this is necessary. And if it is necessary, what are the checks and balances that can be put in place?